Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, or perhaps good evening, wherever you are around this globe, using the World Wide Web. And that, remember, the first W stands for worldwide, or for world, I should say. So we're in potentially many time zones, but it's 3 o'clock here in Eastern time zone in Washington, D.C., where I am located. I'm Mark Walsh, the moderator of today's panel that you have attended. We hope you have a wonderful and exciting and educational time with us for the next 45, 50, perhaps 60 minutes. Before we begin and I introduce our panelists quickly, I'd like to go through some sort of Zoom hygiene and housekeeping to make sure we're all on the same page. First, those of you who are attendees, you'll be muted. And just like in real life, you can't jump in the middle of a conversation. You'll be muted during our time together today. The way you can express yourself or ask a question is to click on the Q&A button down at the bottom and send a question to me. I would also caution you, I've seen many examples where people have done chat all and said something that is kind of embarrassing. So I would caution you if you decide to use the chat button, if it is in fact available to you, to make sure you're chatting with a specific person and not to all. I also want to make sure you understand that we're going to have about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation today, then 15 to 10 minutes of Q&A. Also, as the conversation begins and we continue with questions and answers and comments back and forth, I've told our panelists that they're more than welcome to make a visual gesture, index finger, a wave, or whatever to me, so I can make sure that we have everybody's comments and thoughts not overlapping. Some of you who spend some time on Zoom know that sometimes you can miss pearls of wisdom when one or more people are talking. So I've asked them potentially to try and catch my attention visually with a wave during the comments if they want to add to or potentially rebuke or respond to something that has been said before. I want to make sure also, I think I mentioned this, but be sure to click on the blue box on your ID as you join this group and make sure that your full name is out. You can click on the blue box in the top right of your attendance button and you'll see a rename logo there or link. Please make sure your full name and, if you wish, your affiliation and organization is included. So our attendance and participants list is fully fleshed out. So once again, I'm Mark Walsh. I'm a BPC board member and a venture capitalist here in Washington, D.C. But perhaps as important for today's conversation, I worked at the Small Business Administration for about the last year and a half of the prior presidential administration, the Obama administration. And with us are a number of people who had a particular interest in not only that specific element of the SBA, but the SBA itself in a larger perspective. And perhaps also as important, at how the dollars and funds flow that we've seen sort of colliding with the processes and pathways to small businesses are ramping up, and how small businesses are able or sometimes challenged to be able to apply for these types of funds in the PPP and other programs. Our panelists today are really experts in all facets of this field, so I'm excited to get to them. And for the record, I won't spend much time introducing them. The reason I'm not is that there are two features I would point your attention to. One is called Google. The other is called LinkedIn. So if you'd like to know more about our panelists, other than my very skeletal introduction, please be sure to visit those two sites and type in their names. I also feel like I'm in sort of a show of Hollywood Squares as I'm pointing to various boxes around me. But with no specific order in mind, I'll introduce the four folks who are joining me today. First is Maria Contreras-Sweet. She was the administrator of the SBA, as I mentioned, under the Obama administration. She's now a board member, banker, private equity investor, and a wide variety of things. Also with us is Anne-Marie Mellum. She is a former banker and bank director now. She was head of the 7A program, the sort of flagship loan program that the SBA is most famous for during the prior administration. Also is Javier Sade. Javier is a fintech venture capitalist here in the Washington, D.C. area, and he was former head of the Office of Investment and Innovation at the Small Business Administration. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Rebecca Romero-Rainey. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Independent and Community Bankers of America, a trade association representing a wide variety of banks and financial institutions across our great nation. As you can see from their backgrounds, their titles, and their experiences, these four people represent many of the facets of the prism that is capital flowing from our federal government in various ways to small businesses that need it. In some cases, small businesses that need it more than others, which will be a portion of today's conversation. We'll have a couple of rounds of questions, and then we'll get to Q&A. But let's start off at the very top. And I'd like to address this to the former administrator, Maria Contreras-Sweet. Madam Administrator, which is what I was used to calling you back in the day, but we'll use Maria today to save time. It's great to have you with us, but let's start at the top. And I would like to ask you as a cabinet member, I think the SBA became a cabinet level position under the Clinton presidency. What was your take on having your role at the cabinet level, and how important did you see it during your time to have access to the White House and the other elements of the federal government from that position?
Hi, Mark. Good to see you again. And thank you so much for reminding me of the privilege that I enjoyed, the honor truly to be able to represent America's 30 million small businesses that are spread out throughout our country. I enjoyed bragging about them and boasting that they represent 2/3 of the new jobs created in our country, absent, of course, separate from government. And of course, we all know that small businesses are the ones who create a local culture in our community. You can go to city after city and go into malls and see the national stores, and every town looks like the next town, except when you get to Main Street and you see the small businesses that create a local flair. So it's so critical for us to remember the role that small businesses play in our economy, how they're driving our economy, creating 2/3 of the job, as I just said. Secondly, creating these local places across America on Main Street. But third, also, we find that even corporate America looks to the small business community for their supply chain and even for their innovation. So many corporations have shared with me that when they think of their R&D department, they really call it now M&A, because they're acquiring all the innovation from small businesses. And also small businesses give the ability to corporations to be nimble and to pivot whenever they need to do something different. They go to small businesses who have been driving that innovation. So it was a privilege to represent that group and to say that as we interacted with cabinet, and why it was so important when President Clinton elevated small business department, the SBA, to cabinet, was because he understood all of this, as well as the fact that the ability for me to sit at the table at cabinet and to be able to make certain that the other programs too that are central to SBA were also being respected, like the contracting programs. So many times we talk about the capital, but we forget that SBA drives 1/4 of the federal spend to small businesses. And the way we do that is sitting at cabinet and making sure that every department, from agriculture to defense to education, are all procuring 1/4 of their federal spend from small businesses.
Yeah, I think that access was exactly what you just expressed, seeing it from afar. And certainly there was always talk of Treasury and Commerce interacting with the SBA in various ways. Is it your sense that the SBA probably should and always should stay as an independent member of the cabinet?
Well, thank you for raising that point, because that's exactly right. I've heard over and over at the beginning of each administration that somebody thinks about folding it into Commerce or folding it into Treasury or combining 3 or 4 departments. But again, when we consider the role that small businesses play, they need somebody dedicated solely to their interest and not to compromise their interest and their view. And so when we were bartering, for example, at the trade level with the US trade representative, we insisted, if you recall, that we make certain that small businesses also had a way and a place in which to resolve disputes in the trade agreements. It was the first time in history that we included a small business chapter so that small businesses could navigate and make certain that they were also partaking from the international marketplace. Working with the State Department to make sure that we promoted entrepreneurship around the world was key. Remember that we are inextricably connected. Trade is global. And so if small businesses aren't benefiting from that, that's a big miss for America. And so it was critical to be connected to Commerce, to Treasury, to State Department, agriculture, all those others. And as we navigated the world, every small business that we took on those missions was grateful that their market had been expanded.
Anne Marie, let me go to you for a moment. The 7A program, which I think most people really identify the SBA with, the ability for small businesses using banks as intermediaries, the SBA guaranteeing the loan. You must have either nightmares or certainly an interesting set of reactions as you see this administration set up a $350 billion bucket of capital and try to move it through some of the programs that you ran at your time at that federal agency. You were the boots on the ground, you and your teammates and your colleagues. What are some of the reactions that you're having as you see this program ramp up from 0 to 60 in such a short period of time?
Well, thanks, Mark, and it is nice to see all of you again. First, just quickly, I will get to that, but I want to thank the Bipartisan Organization Center, Policy Center, for doing this, because one of the things that I really appreciated when I was at the SBA was the fact that the SBA enjoys huge support from both sides of the aisle, and to me that was a major factor in us being able to do things. As you can imagine, it makes it a lot easier. So boots on the ground, and what is the SBA doing today? And I'll tell you what, I couldn't be prouder to be an ex-banker or an ex-SBA person, because what they have done, not that there haven't been issues and problems, and they've needed a lot of push, but they have literally when the law was passed, 3 weeks ago, and the program was stood up like a week and a half ago. And my understanding is that they're pretty close right now to running out of giving the full $350 billion in guarantees to probably some million small businesses. So in comparison, the 7A program last year made guarantees to 52,000 businesses worth about $23 billion. Now, that is not totally comparable, because the 7A program, which is the umbrella for this program, is much more complicated, and they've stripped away a lot of the rules which they needed to do so that these PPP funds could be made quickly, very quickly. But you have to hand it to the SBA for getting that program started, and for the lenders, they've all worked night and day, and I've been in touch with lots of them to get this program going and get the money out into small businesses. And I know the money is starting to flow now. I do think that one of the exciting things that's happening here is, it's a novel thing in this program, is they're letting non-bank participants in, and that scares people sometimes. Sometimes it makes people worried, but I think hopefully this is going to be an opportunity for some of the non-banks that have been approved, and we know some of them are major technology firms. PayPal, Intuit, Square have all been confirmed, I know, or approved. It's going to give them a chance to start working directly with the SBA, and I'm hoping that what comes out of this is the start of some ways to start really being able to utilize technology so that systems can be faster and better, and the SBA can really make some progress in terms of making their process much easier for everyone to participate.
Well, I'll get back to you on that, but I couldn't have asked for a better segue if I'd scripted it myself, Anne-Marie, into non-bank firms, and particularly you named technology firms, which are sort of on the front line. And Javier, let's move over to you. As somebody who spends most of their time swimming in the deep waters of fintech, which is sort of a cutesy phrase for a very large and diverse, I know I got to use air quotes every now and then, a very large and diverse universe of entities that are attempting to smooth the path of ones and zeros that really represent what money used to be. You and your colleagues at your firm, or just really writ large, the types of entities that you're dealing with, how do you see fintech playing a role, not so much in the current challenge that everybody faces, but perhaps that what this challenge will represent and the doors it might open for fintech firms going forward?
Well, thank you, Mark, and the fellow panelists for doing this, BPC. Look, my sense is that first and foremost, this is a crisis brought on by biology. And the real problem here is one that hopefully the vast majority of our resources are being spent on, which is trying to stem the ravages of the pandemic. That said, the health crisis very quickly became an economic crisis. And the former two bankers and former lenders in the panel, as well as Rebecca, who's going to speak soon, will tell you that small business lending is specifically inefficient and clunky. It has always been for a lot of reasons, and trying to use the dump truck of the Federal Reserve, Treasury, and SBA combined to pump $1/3 trillion into essentially 30 million small businesses is a very difficult endeavor. Now to your question, technology and innovation have shaped almost every facet of our lives, including finance. And if you look at what happened in the last few crises, 9/11 gave birth to the Department of Homeland Security. The financial crisis, which was one of excessive risk in the financial system, gave birth to Dodd-Frank and the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. The current crisis we're living through right now. And since the last crisis, there have been about $200 billion invested in technologies that either serve as rails, as financing mechanisms, as efficient underwriting constructs to enable both consumers and businesses avail themselves of financing. I am extremely encouraged that a way to put it is that one of the silver linings, if there are any out of this, is that it is forcing, and this is not just SBA, because the Fed and Treasury are also very behind trying to avail ourselves of all these technologies. And the reason why technologies, and you mentioned Square, PayPal, and Intuit, which most people in the United States either know or use, is that they literally are built to be effective and efficient conduits of capital to the very smallest businesses. And those are right now the ones which banks are not so well equipped to handle. There's something to be said here also, and I'll shut up in a second, about the fact that there is a convergence between what everybody thinks about regulated lending and banking and fintech. And the reason the banking system is one of the most critical pillars of our economy is because of the privilege they have with their cost of capital. And that privilege is given, banks can avail themselves from FDIC insurance, which they pay for, but in essence, a way to look at it is it's somewhat of a public subsidy on banks. So I see a lot of real convergence of all these things.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I knew you bring it well, especially with that skull hung on the wall behind you, my friend. But before we get to you, Rebecca, I want to just back up a little bit and ask Anne Marie. Javier used the term clunky, which I think is a technical term in finance. But I'm interested, if you wouldn't mind, just take a moment and maybe unpack a little of that term. What are a couple of things that you might have mentioned or would mention that represent some of the clunkiness or maybe the thickness that the system may have had prior to this crisis? You're muted.
Sorry about that. There are thousands of pages of guidelines that a lender has to understand to use the 7A program, literally thousands. Not only is the rulemaking process so lengthy and cumbersome and frustrating, but what it results in is so much detail and requirements that it's just been built on and over instead of sort of someone taking a clean swipe, which is very hard to do in the federal government for a whole bunch of reasons. Yeah. Notwithstanding 4-year terms, people coming and going every 4 years, that's one thing. And the contracting system is extremely burdensome and lengthy and is challenged all the time. Take, for example, the recent Amazon Microsoft challenge. So for the government to get tech in there to help them on a contract basis is difficult. So the SBA programs have always been very, very difficult to use. And I would say there is progress, but it's been very, very incremental, not like the kind of progress we could make if we could figure out how to avail the technology that's there in concert with the regulators so that we don't take undue risk for the financial systems. But bankers they're dwindling, the number of bankers that use the programs, unless they do huge volumes, because they're just difficult to use. You have to have scale.
Well, as Rahm Emanuel once said, it's never let a good crisis go to waste. And let's turn now to our banker, or the person representing a significant portion of the financial system in our nation. And Rebecca, banks are, and I would argue will be, one of the cornerstones of the American experience. And your membership, especially independent community banks, is about as basic a part of our DNA as one could possibly ask for. What are you hearing from your members about this sort of compression of capital into a pipeline that may not have been able to handle it immediately? What are some of their concerns about what happens on the other end when we come up for air? And what are some issues that they hope are resolved or addressed during or after this crisis?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark, and it's a pleasure to join everyone here today. It's extraordinary what banks, especially my members, the community banks, are going through in this process. And much to what Maria talked about, community banks themselves are small businesses. They are a representation of the local fabric and communities that they represent, and they are the heart of small business lending in this country. And so on one hand, it makes complete sense that through the nation's community banks, which have really stood up and delivered this product to their customers, that they would be heart, if you will, of this delivery system. Flipping that switch from one day to the next, for so many institutions that even to get going didn't even have access to the SBA system. In many cases, it's taken them a week to get it, while they have hundreds of applications coming in the front door. For many of our members, they are processing more in loans this week than they will in an entire year in their institutions. And they're doing it with guidelines that maybe in some cases have not even been written yet, or maybe might change a little bit along the way. And for bankers, that is not a pretty sight. And so certainly challenge. At the end of the day, though, when we set that all aside, I think what it's demonstrated is an incredible ability to work through that clunkiness, to work through the uniqueness of what small businesses are, to deliver this needed aid as quickly as they possibly can. And I think the outcome of this is a way that, one, pushes us all a little bit further down this path of digitization and leveraging technology in smarter ways, and understanding the vital role that small businesses play and how we respond even quicker to ensure that these small businesses survive what said by Yvette is this biology crisis that's quickly becoming an economic crisis.
You know,
Mark,
I noticed,
yeah,
go ahead.
Hear me all right? I just felt that Anne Marie was being so humble, and I just wanted to call her out here, because what she did when she arrived at SBA, to be frank, the community bankers did not have an interface to interact with SBA directly the way we would have liked. And so lamentably, what was happening was that in many instances, those SBA applications were even being sent over to the SBA via fax machines. I did say fax. And so Anne Marie and her team really spent a lot of time and brought in a tech core to make sure that we had systems that would allow the community bankers to interact with the bank, with the SBA much more efficiently. And Anne, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because I just think that that's really what I think is a key tool that SBA has today, was the product of your effort.
Anne
Marie, never let a good compliment go to waste. So please take it away.
Well, yes, thank you for the compliment. And we did accomplish some things, and they're part of what's being used today. But we could have accomplished more had there been some different ways to do that. And I look at what's been done with technology since then, when we were really wanting to utilize more technology, and I think it's just been sort of incremental. I'm really hoping that this bright silver lining here, and as Rebecca said too, really lets everybody understand that when we get through this and it's behind us, let's figure out how next time this happens, our government can get money to people and small businesses in days, not a month, not 2 months. We know we have companies that can do it. Our government ought to be able to do it. And that's going to take coordination with some of those companies and everybody. But thank you for the compliment, Maria. I appreciate it. And because of your leadership that we got a lot of those things done.
Well, let me hop back to Rebecca for a minute, because I think literally as we began our session today at 3 o'clock Eastern, I think both Rebecca and Anne Marie noticed, and Rebecca commented on it, that there was some new guidance handed out. And it seems like we're almost getting fresh data, fresh guidance, fresh structural instruction, so to speak, from the various entities of our federal government. It seems like on an hourly basis. And I know that the banking industry tends not to enjoy that kind of real-time inflow. What are you seeing from your members about how they're getting this data, processing it, and putting it into their systems?
Yeah, so it is quite rapid in terms of pace, and what was just issued today is another round of interim final rule to the tune of 20 pages, which is fantastic because it adds some much needed guidance for qualifying sole proprietors and self-employed borrowers. So that will really be helpful in terms of helping some of those smallest businesses and folks that certainly need this. I think one of the biggest challenges for my members has been they've had so many questions as it relates to eligibility guidelines. And so they want to make sure, first and foremost, that the small businesses take on, let's remember what the small business is signing up for is a loan that will eventually be forgiven if the proceeds are used as the act intends for them to on payroll and other operating costs. So for those banks, they want to make sure that it's very clear for that small business what they're signing up for and what they'll have to do in order to ensure that the loan is forgiven. And then on the back end of that, the bank wants to make sure that their guarantee is structured as it needs to for this loan, and that it's all done properly. And so that's what's been so challenging. And it all goes back to what Anne-Marie talked about. With the size and scale that has been stood up in the course of a week, is extraordinary, and inevitably there's going to be incredible questions that are asked, and hopefully as we go through this process, we are building that infrastructure and the process that will help us, hopefully not the next time, but if in fact this is ever needed again.
Well, you know, I told all the panelists, and I want to tell the participants, that this is not a gotcha session. This is not meant to be critical of what's happening, because so much is happening. And to Rebecca, your point about calling and getting information and stuff, for the last 40 years, the IRS has had random people fake being citizens and called into the IRS for advice, and they've gotten inconsistent advice across various elements of our 1040 form and stuff like that. So getting inconsistent advice and getting advice at all from the federal government is not a feature of this administration. It's a feature of the federal government in many, many ways. And that's not a criticism. That's the nature of complexity. And I think getting back to that word complexity, let me turn quickly to Javier. You know, I think we'll talk later about sort of maybe is there some ways to wipe the slate clean and kind of move things forward more rapidly because of the silver lining. And I use air quotes again for you, my friend. But what are some ways that you are seeing fintech, either in the past with some of the current participants or some of the startups that you and your colleagues in the venture side are seeing, that reduce complexity, or at least make complexity more consistent across different types of borrowers for different types of capital?
Yeah, so what you're hearing from both, from all other three panelists here, is that there's a push and pull between the need to get vast amount of capital urgently out with the pull of regulations that that ensure that you got to know your customer, that people are not laundering money, that identities are double verified, that capital ratios are not broken. There's all kinds of, I mean, if this thing was 800, if the law was 800 pages and the guidance is 20 pages, if you add all of the regulations that touch on banks, they're tens of thousands of pages. So if you were to step back a little bit, just one area in which technology could be brought to bear very quickly has to do with sort of know your customer. And one of the best places in which fraud, you know, one of the big concerns with this thing is the potential for fraud. And because the program was designed as a loan, now that may have been a mistake, probably was a mistake, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is issuing grants to taxpayers and small businesses. So we're trying to kind of fit a square peg in a round hole. But leave that as it may. The IRS has every taxpaying citizen social security number, tax identification number, which means that they all pay payroll taxes either through 1099s or W-2s. We do have, as a federal government, by we, I mean the collective we, have the capacity to use technology in conjunction with all the tools that we have to ensure that, for example, one of the biggest concerns is fraud. Another concern is this issue of loan stacking. And Anne-Marie and I were talking about this not too long ago, which is that a small business may be not trying to attempt fraud, but because they're desperate, they've applied to 10 different banks, right? And it may be, even though the SBA and Treasury and all these places have gateways and gatekeepers to ensure that loan stacking doesn't happen, loan stacking will probably happen. Now, you can argue that digital technology, that is, at the end of the day, this is all ones and zeros, that is stuff you can use to avoid some of the pitfalls of this. On the side of distribution, right? Most of us, I'm sure everybody that's on this call, panelists and listeners, use ACH payments to either pay the federal government their taxes or to get a refund, or most people use digital forms of payment. But a very large number of American small businesses and citizens rely on checks, specifically older citizens, which rely on Social Security payments. There is a natural capacity to printing checks. Last I heard is something like 4 million checks a month can be printed by Treasury. That, you don't have to have a math PhD to figure out that there are some physical and current system constraints in which technology can be used to both help on the push for the money and the distributing of the capital, and on the pull to ensure that banks, especially community banks, which are the lifeblood of Main Streets, to actually comply with regulations.
So let me kick it up a level again, and I didn't know that limit of 4 million checks. That's fascinating, but I guess you're right. Every machine process has a limit. But let me return to you, Maria. You started off at the highest level talking about the globality of small business and the consistency and the interesting interaction that the SBA and leadership had as they traveled the globe to promote the idea of small business being a core feature of the American economic success story. And I know that under your leadership, in my relatively short exposure to it, you had, I think, a significant commitment to diversity and impact investment and ESG commitment and stuff like that. What's your sense, maybe of worry or concern or even maybe enthusiasm that this crisis may dissuade or take some of the focus off of those very normal, very, very admirable goals that the SBA has and has had under your leadership?
Great question, Mark. Let me just say to you that I feel really heartened. I'm sanguine about the future because I know that small businesses understand resiliency. It's how we have lived. We have, as they say, the blood, sweat, and tears of an entrepreneur. We've heard so many stories about that. But connecting to Javier's point, technology today is going to allow small businesses, the sole proprietor, it was just alluded to by Rebecca, to be able to begin anew in such an efficient way. In some ways, it's the best time to start a business. Imagine now that you can start your small business in a box, literally in a day. You can go in and you can go to LegalZoom.com and get incorporated. You can go to Zen and get your payroll. You can go to Indiegogo and raise your capital. You can now, as we did when we were there, put a small business startup package in a box and listed, enumerated all of the different technologies available to a small business. So for the small businesses that I met, they might have been a great baker or a great technician or something, but now with all the facility around technology, they can just put up their skill and then get this support system instantly. So it allows them to go international, domestic, regional in very short order, and I'm heartened by that. And so I think that takes down the barriers to entry, and so that people of all backgrounds can now get into the business. What I learned over and over from talking to these small business lenders is that many times we do have an implicit bias about who might be successful or not, but through technology, it sort of takes away, maybe you stutter, maybe you're, have a certain whatever challenge that you might have, but through technology, it erases all of that and it creates an equal footing for all of us. And so I'm heartened by the opportunity, and I encourage people to think hard. If they can't get their corporate job right away, but always had a dream, this is actually the best time to start thinking about starting it. Use this time wisely. And I think that's an important message for all of us. How do we use this opportunity to get going. And second, the second point, Mark, that I want to share is to your point about diversity and inclusion. And, so many times we talk about the flyover states, or these are opportunities now for us to think about ways in which that we include everybody as policymakers. How do we make sure that we're including all people in our implementation? So for example, right now we say in contracting, as I mentioned earlier, 23% of what the federal government buys is supposed to be directed to small businesses. If we really believe that small businesses are our way forward, why don't we increase that number? Who decided it was 23%? It could be 40%. It could be 50%. If we want America to be strong today, then we ought to think hard about how we think about policy and what policy changes we can nudge to be sure that everybody's given an opportunity. Imagine, Mark, if cities, if counties, regional governments, and the federal government all committed to procure from small businesses, then you know that those are going to be local, domestic jobs. And I think those are the opportunities that are presented ahead of us.
I love your optimistic attitude. I hope it's shared more and more. Sometimes we can get very, very dark during these times. And let me, this isn't a lightning round, but I think sort of one last round of questions to all four of you. And I'll start from that basis of Maria's comments. Rebecca, optimism is something maybe in short supply in some places. And I know that your members, in some cases, have felt, forgive the phrase, once burned, twice shy, but sometimes banks and their interaction, occasionally collision with regulators and legislators, makes for a tough relationship and some tough outcomes. What are some of the concerns about these programs that you're hearing from their banks? Like maybe it will disappear after a while and they'll be left holding some paperwork that isn't so appealing. What are some things you're hearing?
Well, that's one of them. Again, given specifically with the PPP program, just the extraordinary nature and the volume of the transactions that my members are taking on is just that underlying concern. Is this going to work as we've all envisioned? Because it's not clearly laid out in paper yet. So that is an overarching worry for many. I think the other piece that we looked at, especially over maybe the midterm and all of this, is we don't know how long this is going to last, and as a result, what the impact ultimately will be. And I see it every time I talk to a community banker. They're doing something extraordinary to work with and support their communities through this time, and that's loan modifications, it's new loan funding, it's line of credit. I mean, it's everything that we can think of, and so we will need regulatory flexibility as we work through this. These potentially troubled credits are troubled for no fault of the borrower. And this is just an extraordinary time. So how you regulate, how you examine, how you think of asset quality in a situation like this is just a big question mark for everybody involved. And so, back to Maria's optimism, I think that's how we all have to approach this. We have to look at this in terms of we're creating a new norm each and every day, and we can't fall back to some of our past experiences or expectations. We have to create the infrastructure and the environment that works, that gets this country back up on its feet and responds sooner rather than later. And I've been very grateful to see that sentiment coming from the agencies as they encourage banks and bankers to work with their community and are coming to the table to discuss the challenges and leverage the tools of the federal government to support the banks in doing that. And so I am very optimistic, but to your point, there is concern, especially as we don't know what we don't know yet, and that continues to unfold.
So before we get to Anne Marie and Javier for our last element of the lightning round, let me remind the participants that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It is text only, but feel free to send me, if you wish, questions that I can curate and relate to our great panelists. We'll be going to Q&A in probably about 7 or 8 minutes or so. So feel free, we already have a couple, feel free to send those along, and my colleagues who are off screen and I will curate them and make sure that they're great questions to finish out our conversation together. So Anne Marie, let me move to you for a couple of last thoughts before we go to Q&A. You touched on it before, the factory being ramped up in such an amazing fashion. a factory that had thousands of pages of paperwork surrounding it in the past. What are some, again, maybe on the optimistic thematic that we're hewing to here, what are some ways that you see perhaps some incremental changes? I know we've talked about wiping the slate clean, but even some incremental changes that you see from your colleagues you're keeping in touch with at the 7A program, or whatever the PPP sort of colors and the umbrella element of that. You're on mute. It's okay. It's good.
You can't teach me anything. I don't learn. One of the things that, that's going to come up next, and I'm really hoping that this piece of this program is going to be really slick, and that is the guarantee purchase by the SBA. In the last crisis, the guarantee purchases built up, and there were hundreds of attorneys and people that reviewed every request, and there was a backlog, and it took a long time to get those guarantees. Again, a more complicated program. I'm hoping this time that just as the rules for the PPP have been stripped away and still leaving some reasonable teeth in the program, I hope that the rules for honoring the guarantee get totally stripped away. I'm hoping that bankers and lenders can just certify of what they've done, and that then the request goes right to Treasury to get that money back into the bank's hands. I don't know for sure what's happening there. That we'll find out, but that will be an opportunity. And then with the application and the reimbursement of the guarantee systems being more streamlined, I'm just hoping that some of that thinking and technology can work its way into the normal guarantee programs, so that they can remove, a few of those pages of rules. We removed a few, but a lot more need to be removed. And it's not just technology; it's how we ensure that the process, that what is agreed upon that's needed can get handled. And I'm optimistic about that too. I really am. I think there are a number of reasons why this point in time may result in some real progress, making our financial system still safe, but faster, smoother, and easier.
Well, listening to you, it's difficult not, as I see the greenery in the window behind you, not to be reminded of nothing else. If we streamline this, we'll save some trees from being crushed and turned into paper for those thousands of pages of regulation that certainly I saw when I was there. Pardon me. And let's wrap up with an optimistic fervor that perhaps will come from Javier. Javier, fintech companies, as you mentioned earlier, have had extraordinary amounts of capital committed to them in various silos and some of the platforms and individual applications in the fintech arena. But governments, city, local, state, and federal, they're tough customers. What are some ways that you've seen fintech companies get corporate or enterprise or even not-for-profit customers that are not government, some sort of sales and implementation ways that have been successful that you think might kind of work with government? Or is it really due to this crisis wiping the slate clean, where there'll be lots of opportunity, or somewhere in between?
I think it's somewhere in between. I don't see a world, or I'm not sure anybody can see a world in which we completely wipe the slate clean. But what regardless of the extreme divides that you are seeing by the nature of the fact that $2.3 trillion had to be committed to our economy a week into this, points to some calcified problems that our society has with credit, with debt, with our government itself over-levering. What I'm hopeful about, though, and that's probably not the optimism you were looking for, but what I will say is that in situations where speed, where scale, and where immutability are critical, human beings are very fallible, and technology has a significant amount of potential. A lot of the money that has been invested in financial innovation has been, rightfully so, focused at consumer credit and consumer constructs to access more credit or more financial services. But the fact is that a lot of those fintech companies and some in our portfolio that actually serve enterprises and banks themselves. So I do see that this convergence, and by convergence I mean banks becoming much more centric, and they are, and fintech companies being forced to, in so many ways, the ones that want to get in this game, comply with regulations that otherwise they wouldn't have had to comply with, will yield what I think is going to be a better, hopefully, financial system. Over.
So it's time for Vox Populi, as they say in the question and answer business. And we've got some interesting submissions from our audience. I will shorten, but direct the first question, who comes from an old friend of many of ours, Arthur Plews. And I'll direct it to you, Maria. Arthur talks about the current rules of PPP block certain categories of people from getting loans based upon their history with the criminal justice system, specifically probation and parole. And as Arthur notes, I think it's almost 5 million people are on probation and parole in our nation, and many are likely small business owners. What's your sense, if any, on that, and whether the ACLU or other folks are pushing this agenda forward? Do you have any clarity or even an opinion on whether this should be addressed during this tough time?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Thank you, Arthur.
Yeah.
Arthur may recall that one of the programs that I promulgated was what I call Ban the Box. And I felt that, in white collar crime, if somebody commits a crime, they went left when they should have gone right, that after they serve their time, we remember, we forgive people, we give them a second chance. And so too, I felt that at every level, what was somebody that's looking for a microloan all the way up, if they've served their time, if they've served society and now want to begin anew, I think this is an opportunity for us to help them out and help them do that. And access to capital, because largely this population is not going to be hired by a corporation, by government. And so truly it is through entrepreneurship that they can get back on their feet to begin to make their families whole and provide for them. And so I think in some way we must find a way forward to be able to provide for this population. I also think that as we approach this in a new way, I think we are going to have to think of new constructs, as was just outlined. And that is that as small businesses re-enter and begin to bring their people back online, we're going to have to think hard about how do we still respect HIPAA, the Health Privacy Act, as well as make sure that we're keeping our customers safe, that we're keeping our employees safe, and our families safe. So I think it's going to be a big opportunity for us at the corporate and small business level to think about new governance models, new rules, ways in which we can set people apart and still have them enjoy each other's company in a restaurant, in a theater. This is going to be a whole new normal. And so I think for small businesses, again, since we're the innovators, we ought to think hard about these solutions and how we can provide really new avenues for small businesses to grow, but particularly those disadvantaged. I think we have to make sure that we bring them online in some way and set a new table that includes inclusivity for everybody.
There actually were a number of questions along this theme, and I think your comments really address a lot of the elements of it. And I would just encourage the participants or their colleagues or whatever, if you believe in this issue that the question outlined and Maria responded to, write your congressman, write your senator, reach out, make your voices heard, because legislation and regulation are typically not changed unless these folks are told that they should be. So that's something to consider. The next question comes from an old buddy of mine, Matt Wheeler, and I'll direct it at you first, Rebecca, and potentially to Anne Marie as well, but all four of you. And that is, do you think there's going to be a second round of PPP? And before you answer, the 350, as it has been chronicled, supposedly is close to being used up. It's unclear to me how that math works, because I haven't heard too many stories of people getting these large loans. So I'm interested in kind of where the thermometer is. But do you see a second round of PPP coming? And if so, sort of how and when?
Well, unfortunately, the data is not easily accessible to many of us. The numbers that you hear out there in terms of the monies, it's more of what's been committed. So what loan approvals have been given. There is not a way yet to check what's actually been funded. My banks can't go in today and actually say this is what we've dispersed. So that's something, a big thing that needs to be fixed in this process. I think there's tremendous legislative support to put more money into this. That did not get through cleanly in the Senate last week. It's being picked up again this week. Given some of the challenges that we've seen with the program, I don't think it's going to be easy to get this money funded, but I see a scenario unfolding where, in fact, additional monies are eventually committed to PPP loans.
So here's the last question as we wrap up our session together. It's a lightning round question that one of our participants asked. It's the magic wand crystal ball question. Okay, so I'll start with you, Anne Marie, and I'll go around the circle and let Maria, at least the way I'm seeing my screen, let Maria be the anchor on this race. If you were in charge for one day, either of the whole Megillah or your old agency or arena or whatever you wish, you were in charge for one day, what's one thing you would change or amend or get rid of or add or whatever to sort of show your vision?
That's a good question and a tough one. If I was in charge of the whole Megillah, I think somehow what I'd want to do is figure out a way to get regulators, agencies, lawmakers, fintech too, but get everybody at the table and somehow figure out a way to move progress faster. I feel like one of the global things that it seems to be happening is that our government, our federal government is getting slower and slower, and some of our great corporations are getting better and better. And I feel like when I was a little girl, our federal government was the big Megillah, and I don't feel like that anymore. So I would try to figure out how to get the parties together necessary, and they have to work together. They have to. Financial system needs all those constituents to figure out and mandate and move how to move forward into a more modern age in terms of process, technology, and thinking. So that's probably not very clear, but.
No, I asked for a magic wand and you set the bar pretty high with a big magic wand. So let's move on to you, Javier. What is your answer to that question?
I think thematically, I'm aligned with what Anne-Marie is saying. There's been a significant erosion of trust in our institutions. And I'm not talking about the last 3 years, I'm talking about over decades. And concurrently with that erosion of trust, you've also seen a very difficult pathway to get at common truth. And part of the fault of that has to do with technology and the silos in which we sit. My sense is that if I was in charge of the whole Megillah, I would be very focused on trying to unite us around a common call of action. And if what we're going through now doesn't provide us with that, it is very difficult to do. By the way, our financial system is all about trust. I mean, people using money, this is ones and zeros. None of this exists, right? It's all in our heads, and it's trust. So to me, it's about trying to shore up and buttress the level of trust erosion we've had over the last, 40, 50 years.
Rebecca?
I see a common theme developing here. I think for me, to Anne Marie's point, specifically, this program has been stood up in a very short period of time. So we got that piece figured out, but what we didn't have is the diversity of opinions and thought around the table to maybe pause for just a moment to get a few of the questions figured out before we jumped all into this. And I think for me that is the biggest part. So many of these incredibly large decisions are being made amongst a very small group of people. And that is the nature of the way government works these days. And I think we're paying the price in terms of not having a variety of perspectives or opinions that'll come to the table and help us ultimately craft a better solution. So to think about that diversity of opinion and thought, and to take a little bit longer in that process to be able to construct and deliver some of the solutions, I think would be a significant part of the solution here.
Well, in the Venn diagram of life, speed and good policy are two circles that don't have a lot of overlap, which is your point. Batting cleanup, Maria, what are your thoughts on this final question?
Well, I echo all of these wise, sage people's advice. It reminds me of that old story, right? That old adage about, there's a hole in the boat, and the guy in the back says, "Oh, but it's on the port side, and we're on the starboard." Well, the point is, there's a hole in the boat, and we're all in it. And so I say that, just when I was Secretary of Business, Transportation, and Housing in California, we convened everybody around 9/11. And so I say there are no borders right now in terms of the global challenge that we find ourselves in. It's a true pandemic. In that regard, I would convene the scientists, as was aptly pointed out. I would convene, the policy leaders around the world. I would just convene the practitioners, the corporations and financial institutions, come together and talk about how we solve this in totality, because we're all in the boat and we're in the boat together. And you can't keep this away. Now we have learned our lesson that we cannot keep this at the airports. It's going to come in. If somebody has it in China, if somebody has it in Africa, it's on us to make sure that we're helping them solve problems so that they can help us in turn solve ours.
Well, I'd like to just suggest that when I worked with the BPC to cook this up, I said, when all four of you agreed, that I had the dream team to start off our first session talking about PPP and these economic events that are going on around us. So the first of many sessions the BPC will sponsor and execute. And you guys have set the bar extraordinarily high, because you are the dream team. And on behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center and my colleagues there, I just want to thank all four of you, Anne Marie, Javier, Rebecca, and Maria, for your time and your thoughts today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
No, take care.
Mark, if there's 1 second left, we just want to remind everybody that there's equal amount of money for counseling. And so I would urge everybody to go to their local counseling centers, whether it's the Small Business Development Center, the Women Business Centers, the VBox for veterans, and of course, the USSBA.gov, the Treasury. All of these sites are available for counseling, and we're given an equal amount of resources to make sure that they were providing counseling to small businesses through this very turbulent time.
Hear, hear. Well said. Thanks again, everybody. This concludes the meeting. We hope you enjoyed it.